Alright, peace family. It's none other than your brother, Professor Ace, Osaidan Patar, OG Ogun, old Eastside Hotel Charlie. Now I'm riding around streets of Atlanta. In my thoughts, I recently watched a video by the brother Q Butter, where he was talking about the conspiracy to keep blacks out of STEM. You know what I'm saying? Just thinking about that, reflecting. I'm always solution oriented, so I'm always trying to think, okay, well, if something is actively fighting against you, you know what I'm saying, what are the ways that you can combat whatever that antagonist may be? So, I was just thinking, okay, well, exactly what are the forces and factors that attempt to keep black people out of STEM? Just reflecting on my own life experience, matriculating through school, high school, college, and even in professional life. You know what I'm saying? In my opinion, you know what I'm saying, there are like three different ways in which either black people are discouraged from going into STEM or encouraged to go into STEM, but actively dispositioned to go into like the lower tiers, the lower levels in the hierarchy of STEM. And I'll talk more about the hierarchy in STEM, you know what I'm saying, as we progress. You know what I'm saying? But the first antagonist is just, the system in which we live in, where, majority of employment opportunities, job opportunities, whether you're applying to higher education, you're basically applying, unless you're trying to go to a HBCU, you're basically, applying to an institution that is run by non-black people. And if the individuals in those institutions have issues with black people, then they'll actively try to keep you out of the education or the employment opportunities or the money-making opportunities, you know what I'm saying? So, obviously that exists, you know what I'm saying? But then, there are other levels, and even when I reflect on my experience, there are white people who are racist. I remember I was in one interview when I was fresh out of college, and the guy straight up told me, he said, we're interviewing you because we have to fill a quota. We're going to hire the owner's nephew, and he's white, but we're just interviewing you to fill a quota. And I was like, at the time I was like, 21, 22 years old, you know what I'm saying? So I didn't really know how to handle it. If that would have happened now, obviously, you know what I'm saying, you could have a lawsuit on your hands if you can prove that discrimination. But at the time, I was just like, wow. You know what I'm saying? I did my little interview, called it practice, and then kept it moving. But, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, so there are white people who will actively and openly discriminate against you. And then there are white people who will help you out. They'll help you get into positions, give you opportunities. You know what I'm saying? So, you really got to take it on a case-by-case basis. I know a lot of the opportunities I had, even from grad school to professional life, a lot of Indian people gave me opportunities. You know what I'm saying? From my thesis advisors to my first internships to some of my first employment opportunities. A lot of those opportunities were made possible by Indian people. You know what I'm saying? But yeah. So yeah, there are different levels. There are, I guess, people of other races that do make attempts to keep black people out of STEM. And, then there are people of other races that make attempts to get black people into STEM. You know what I'm saying? They set up different organizations, you know what I'm saying, different nonprofits to help get us into STEM. But yeah, just reflecting on the culture that I grew up in. You know what I'm saying? There's a certain component that exists within black American culture that discourages and doesn't promote, STEM amongst black children. You know what I'm saying? And it's funny, I was watching this show on HBO Max called The South Side. And this lady was she had two boys. One boy is good at basketball, and the other boy is good in science, you know what I'm saying? And she's always praising the boy that's good in basketball, and she's always putting down the boy who's good in science, you know what I'm saying? But Yeah, so I mean, in terms of forces and factors that keep us out of STEM, like one is a culture amongst black people that doesn't necessarily promote STEM. You know what I'm saying? And then the other level is a culture that exists where black people may be encouraged to go into STEM, but we're encouraged to go into the lower levels in the hierarchy of STEM, right? And I need to speak about that hierarchy of STEM first, you know what I'm saying, so you'll know what I'm talking about. And when we're talking about the culture that exists in the black American community that doesn't necessarily encourage or promote STEM amongst the children, like, because the black American community is a subset of the larger American community, I think that issue is really is an American problem more so than just a black American problem. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not just black people who don't look favorably upon math. Like, that's an American thing. You know, that's a culturally American thing where if you're mathematically insufficient or mathematically illiterate, it's okay. We don't, like, if somebody couldn't read, like, we make fun of Floyd Mayweather because he can't read or he doesn't read well. But if somebody is incapable of solving a simple linear algebra equation, you know what I'm saying, we don't have the same level of smoke for them. We don't chastise them. We don't make fun of them. But if culturally, if we did make fun of people whose quote unquote math wasn't math and who weren't mathematically literate, you know what I'm saying, you know, that would motivate people to become more efficient in math. You know what I'm saying? But because, you know, it's almost acceptable to a certain extent to be mathematically illiterate or mathematically insufficient, you know what I'm saying, that kind of has it where culturally, you know what I'm saying, in America and in the black American community and the greater American community as a whole, where, you know, math is just not valued as much as certain other areas, you know what I'm saying, of education. Like in the black American culture, you know what I'm saying, we have a culture that promotes athletics and entertainment as goals to our children, as their plan A, and education as plan B, you know what I'm saying? And because we have that culture that promotes athletics and entertainment so much, it should not be a surprise that we have so many black millionaire athletes and entertainers, and yet not as many blacks in STEM. And I mean, when you compare science and math to sports, like, you can't necessarily say that science and math are harder than basketball and football or any other sports. Like, literally, bro, you be hearing, like, what's funny is you be hearing stories about people with, like, hey, I dribbled the basketball from sun up to sun down. I woke up shooting basketball, and I went to sleep shooting the basketball. I used to sleep with the basketball in my bed, and you know what I'm saying? Like will literally make the sport their entire life. Spend damn near I remember being a young man. I spent a lot of time, way more time, practicing at basketball, practicing and training for football than I ever did in my educational endeavors. If you just had to add up the hours, you know, if I had to add up the hours I spent playing basketball between the ages of 13 and 18 versus the hours I spent studying math, it's no comparison. I spent way more time practicing, playing, or training for some athletic event than I ever did studying math. So in terms of, like, the amount of time you have to take to get better at one versus the other, to get better at athletics versus science and math, it takes way more time. It takes way more time to be a top-tier, top-level athlete than it does to succeed in math and science. But yet we promote athletics and entertainment amongst the youth more so than we do math and science. Secondly, the chances of you becoming a professional athlete or entertainer, the probability of you becoming a professional athlete or entertainer where you actually earn money off of that skill, the probability is far less than you actually earning money based on the skill of science, technology, engineering, or math. So in terms of a money-making endeavor, it makes more sense. It makes more sense to train in STEM than it does to train in athletics. But we don't have a culture that promotes that amongst the youth. And then let's talk about the depression. Let's talk about the depression. Any young man who trained, spent all those hours training in the gym, on the field, in the hot sun, doing two-a-days, and they don't end up going to the league. Any young man in their early 20s who's not in the league, who you knew played a sport in either high school or college, there's a certain level of depression that they're experiencing, that they had experienced because they didn't go to the league. Their dream was unfulfilled. So they're crushed. You know what I'm saying? But yet the probability of you making and earning money in STEM, you wouldn't even have to experience that depression. You wouldn't feel like all that time you spent trying to get good in those athletic endeavors wasn't a waste of time. You wouldn't have to experience that depression. So when we look at like the ethnicities that tend to do well in science, technology, engineering, and math, and the countries from where they come from and the cultures in those countries, right? We can say that generally speaking, right, they have a culture that values and celebrates science, technology, engineering, and math. You talk about China, Japan, India, Germany, even Nigeria. They all encourage, value, and push their children to pursue science, technology, engineering, and math. And that propels them into the upper echelons of those fields. Another thing that those countries have in common is the fact that they all have a historical, cultural mythology that deifies STEM, right? And that I feel like that's an important part. The fact that not only do they have a culture that values STEM, but STEM is so important historically in their cultures that the people saw it, they saw it as so important that they deified, they created STEM gods and STEM goddesses. They deified STEM because of the importance and relevance to their culture, right? In India, they have Vishvakarma, the god of engineering, architecture, and blacksmithing. China has Luban, a deified architect, carpenter, and engineer and inventor. Japan has a blacksmithing god. The German and Nordic people, of course, you know, have Thor, a blacksmithing god. Nigeria, as you know, has Ogun and Orunmila, gods of blacksmiths and mathematics, respectively. Then even in ancient cultures that excelled in STEM, they deified STEM. Like ancient Egypt, you have Ptah, Sekhmet, Seshat, and Tahuti, gods of blacksmiths, physicians, surveyors, mathematicians, respectively. And even the ancient Greeks had STEM gods like Hephaestus, a blacksmith god, or the Romans had Vulcan, a blacksmith god. So I think that there's a significance. You know what I'm saying? I don't necessarily say that correlation equals causation, right? Because we know that's not necessarily true. But there seems to be a correlation between cultures and countries that have deified STEM to people coming from those cultures and countries who excel at STEM. Even if we look at America, right, and we want to say, okay, we're not going to deal with necessarily a cultural, religious mythology, but just a cultural mythology. In America, that cultural mythology that elevates STEM is basically sci-fi movies. And people who are fans of those sci-fi movies also tend to be what? They tend to be your nerds who excel in science, technology, engineering, and math, right? So there's something about having a mythology or fiction within one's culture that elevates STEM that helps to encourage the people who are part of that culture to go into STEM, right? So in terms of combating the conspiracy to keep blacks out of STEM, I think that that's a valuable tool that can be employed to help encourage black people into STEM, right? So when we think about Dr. Mae Jemison, right, the first black woman astronaut from America, right? In her story, she said she was motivated to become an astronaut by watching a sci-fi show, Star Trek, and Lieutenant Uhura. So if it wasn't for the depiction of the black Lieutenant Uhura in the sci-fi show Star Trek, in that science fiction, if it wasn't for that science fiction cultural mythology, then she may not have been motivated to go into STEM. But we see how, because that existed, it encouraged her to go into STEM. Another brother, Dr. Ronald Millett, who is an African-American theoretical physicist, said he was motivated by the science fiction novel called The Time Machine to go into theoretical physics, right? So there are many examples where having a cultural mythology or fiction that elevates STEM helps encourage people to go into STEM, right? And so then when we look in the black conscious community, right, and the different mythologies or fictions that exist in the black conscious community which elevate STEM, we can also see examples where that mythology motivated people in science, technology, engineering, and math. Whether you're talking about the Nation of Islam or the Five Percenters with their supreme mathematics, cultural mythology. The brother Q Butter said on his show that what motivated him to go into engineering was the 5% talk, the supreme mathematics talk. Peace, God, was today's mathematics. Now, we know today that the supreme mathematics of the 5%ers was essentially numerology, right? Which is a mathematical mythology. But that mathematical mythology can provide motivation to you operatively to go into objective mathematics, science, engineering, and technology, right? So that's one example. And again, say what you want about the W.E.Bians and the shortcomings of their leader, but they had a cultural mythology and fiction that did in fact encourage black people to study science, right? So again, that's another example where when you have a cultural mythology or fiction that elevates science, technology, engineering, and math, it encourages the people of that culture to go into those operative fields, right? And so even if you're a person who is like, you know what I'm saying, you're an atheist or you're against God concepts, right? You don't necessarily have to have a cultural or religious mythology where that fictional character is God. You can just have science fiction, right? You can just have science fiction as your cultural mythology, right? But that still serves the same purpose of having that cultural mythology / fiction that can elevate scientists, technologists, engineering, and mathematicians in the minds of the people of that culture to help encourage those people to go into that area, right? So maybe you know what I'm saying, the mythology of the Nation of Islam or the mythology of the 5%ers or the mythology of the W.E.Bians, maybe that's not right for you. Maybe you can find that fiction to help promote it to the youth through Afrofuturism, right? Or black science fiction, right? But it still serves that same purpose. It still serves the same purpose in order to combat the conspiracy to keep us out of STEM. So I spoke earlier about the hierarchy that exists in STEM, right? And so what I mean by that is, like, so within the field science, technology, engineering, and math, there's a hierarchy in terms of each subsequent field builds on the other, right? So for example, you cannot have technology without engineers. You cannot have engineers without scientists, and you cannot have scientists without mathematicians, right? So if you were to separate those fields into a hierarchy, math would be at the top, right? Because you can't have the other fields without math, right? Then science would be next, because you can't have engineering and technology without science, because engineering is applied science, and you can't have technology without the engineers to develop them, right? So the hierarchy in STEM is math at the top, then science, then engineering, then technology at the bottom. And then within each of those fields, right, there's another hierarchy that exists within each of those fields, where you have the theoretical or research component, which is higher than the applied or experimental component, right? So in the math, on the math level, you would have your pure mathematicians at the very top, and then under them you would have the applied mathematicians, again, because the pure mathematicians are developing the equations and proving and deriving the equations that the applied mathematicians utilize, right? Then when you get into the science level, right, you have your pure theoretical and research scientists. Then under them you have your applied and experimental scientists, again, because the applied and experimental scientists are proving and testing the theories of the theoretical scientists, right? Then on the engineering level, you have the same paradigm, where you have your pure theoretical and research-based engineers, and then under them you have your field and hands-on and more practical engineers. And then in technology, again, you have your technologists, you have your technicians, and at the very bottom you have your tradespeople. Now when you look at that hierarchy that exists in STEM, you know what I'm saying, right? And then you think of it specific examples, then it makes sense, right? Like your mechanics, they would be at the bottom, right? You have your automotive mechanics and your automotive technicians. They would be at the bottom in the technology level, right? You cannot have your mechanics without your mechanical engineers. You cannot have mechanical engineers without physicists, and you cannot have physicists without mathematicians, right? When you think about the electrical context, the electricians, they're on the bottom of the pyramid, right? As a tradesperson or a technician. And you cannot have electricians without electrical engineers. You can't have electrical engineers without physicists, and you can't have physicists without mathematicians. When you think about your IT technicians, your technical support people, IT and computer security people, right? They all are on the bottom in terms of being in the technology field, right? But you can't have any of those positions without computer programmers, software designers, and application developers. You can't have those positions without your software engineers, your computer engineers, and your computer scientists. And you can't have your computer scientists without electrical engineers. Can't have electrical engineers without physicists. Can't have physicists without mathematicians, right? So that's the hierarchy. Even let's go to the fields of medicine, right? Your LPNs, your CNAs, your RNs, right? Your physicians, all of those essentially exist at the bottom of this pyramid in the technology field, right? And then you can't have your LPNs, your CNAs, your RNs, and your physicians without the engineers who develop the equipment that they use. You can't have the equipment that the engineers develop without the scientists, like the biologists, the chemists, the anatomists, the epidemiologists, and the etologists, etc. And you can't have any of them without math, right? So that's the hierarchy that exists in STEM. And when you look at that hierarchy, it's hard to look at that hierarchy and all of the different fields that are represented by STEM and say that, well, black people aren't in STEM, because of course black people are in STEM. 75 to 85% of all the black men that I know are in STEM in that bottom level of the hierarchy in terms of being a tradesperson or a technician. When you talk about your automotive mechanics, your electricians, IT technicians, nurses, RNs, LPNs, CNAs, dental hygienists, your general contractors, your carpenters, construction workers, HVAC, all of those positions are essentially in the technology field, and they fall under a tradesperson or a technician, right? And most of the black men that I know work in those areas. And then, like, when we go to the higher levels in the hierarchy, in math and science and engineering, right? When black people are represented, we tend to be in the applied side more so than the theoretical side, right? So when we really look at how we're dispositioned when we do go into STEM, at every level, it seems like we're dispositioned at the bottom levels of the hierarchy. Now, what's crazy about that is that paradigm actually reflects a real conspiracy, right, that is documented, that was devised in the late 1800s and has been a part of black American culture ever since. And so it all goes back to Booker T. Washington, right? Booker T. Washington was the black leader in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that encouraged black people to go into the trades, go, you know what I'm saying, work with your hands. So this is just a quick excerpt from a paper that I read, right? I wanted to put it in here. It said, Booker T. Washington was a former slave who became one of the most influential African Americans of his generation. He was an author, political leader, teacher, and speaker. Washington was determined to secure an education and to teach others. He had clear ideas on how to improve the lives of African Americans. He believed in accommodating and promoting self-help and manual skills rather than studying liberal arts, believing that they would be less threatening to the white community. So Booker T. Washington believed that black people acquiring manual skills would make them less threatening to the white community. Washington was in favor of the idea that an industrial vocational education, trade skills, would produce a black who would fit into the lower end of the occupational structure and, more important, know his or her place among whites and come to accept that place as proper. Wow. Such a form of education was just what white society sought. For Southerners, it would keep blacks subservient and exploitable. For Northerners, it would serve as a way of calming racial tensions and providing a well-trained, laboring underclass that could be used in an effort to industrialize the South. For these reasons, wealthy philanthropists in both the North and the South were willing to give large grants to institutions that adopted this vocation model of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington's famous Atlanta Compromise speech, they call it the Atlanta Compromise speech. Nobody ever says, well, what was being compromised? Why is it called the Atlanta Compromise? What was he compromising? What he was compromising was the ambitions of black people in order to maintain the status quo of white people. Essentially, in that speech, he was telling black people, don't seek the higher levels, the higher tiers in the hierarchy of STEM. No, start at the bottom and be happy at the bottom and only pursue positions at the bottom. This is a direct quote from Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech. He says that our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we must overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the production of our hands and fail to keep in mind that we shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. It is at the bottom of life we must begin and not the top. So Booker T. Washington openly advocated for black people to go into STEM, right? But go into the bottom, the trades positions primarily. There's a famous statue of Booker T. Washington. The statue was designed by a white man, but the statue is called Lifting the Veil of Ignorance, right? On the statue, Booker T. Washington is lifting the veil off of the newly freed black person who's sitting on an anvil, and that person's eyes are looking up, right? Looking up at the different possibilities. But Booker T. Washington's hand is pointing down. They're like, it's, boy, look, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. How many words is a statue worth? I always tell people, I'm like, look at that statue and tell me, what does it say to you? Now, Booker T. Washington's adversary, W.E.B. DuBois, he also encouraged black people to go into STEM, but he only encouraged it amongst what he called the talented 10th. And the talented 10th really didn't have anything to do with talent. It was more so the wealthy 10th, right? The elites. If you could afford to go to college or university, then W.E.B. Du Bois was like, we need only the talented 10th to go to college to pursue these different higher level degrees, and then they can come back and teach the community. The problem with Du Bois's plan was that wasn't happening, right? Once those wealthy black people who are able to go to afford college at the time went to college, they didn't come back to the hood. They didn't come back to the community. They moved away in a different neighborhood, in a different community. And so, the impact on the culture of Du Bois's plan is that even by acknowledging the reality that there's a hierarchy in STEM, it sounds as if you're being elitist, right? It sounds as if you're being bougie. It sounds as if you're putting down people who work in the trades. And that's not it at all, right? All of those positions are necessary for nation building. We should encourage black people to go in every level, at every tier in STEM, from the theoretical to research to the applied experimental, hands-on, etc., right? But the fact that we're overrepresented at the bottom, in the bottom tiers of STEM, is indicative of a conspiracy that wasn't conspired to keep us out of STEM. It was conspired to push us into STEM, but to exist on the bottom levels, to serve as foundational cornerstones to prop up the rest of society. You know what I'm saying? It's pretty obvious that the correct approach is not the idea of W.E.B. Du Bois, where only the most talented or most wealthy people should pursue higher degrees, and nor is it the approach of Booker T. Washington, where we should go into STEM, but we should only try to ever exist at the bottom levels of that hierarchy. You know what I'm saying? Clearly, we should encourage the youth to go into STEM and pursue whichever level of STEM is your interest, right? Whatever you're fascinated by, whether you're fascinated with the theoretical, whether you're fascinated with the hands-on. This is why I always advocate to my young people, when you're getting started, take a personality test, take a skills assessment test to find out exactly what it is that you're passionate about, you need to know objectively what it is you're passionate about, what it is you want to pursue, what it is that you're good at, right? And try to pick an area or field that aligns with that. Right? That way work won't feel like work. It'll be more aligned with something that you just want to do, right? That you're naturally interested in. And even if there's a field, right, that you're interested in, but you're not naturally good at, or you're not naturally gifted at, you can force yourself to get good at it. And that's what we do in sports and athletics all the time. We bring it around full circle, right? Where, you know what I'm saying, you spend so much time practicing, you spend so much time training, trying to force yourself to get good at something that you're not naturally good at. Now, here's the thing, right? If we look at professional athletes, there are many professional athletes who are naturally gifted to be good at whatever sport that they play, right? There are other professional athletes who were able to become professionals because of the hours of dedication and hard work they spend in to forcing themselves to get good at that particular sport. So that same paradigm exists, right? There are people who are naturally gifted. They have a natural intuition at science, technology, engineering, or math, right? But at the same time, you can repeatedly train and practice and get good and get better at any area that you feel is valuable or needed amongst our people, right? And all those cliches that they say when you're training for sports apply. You know what I'm saying? My football coach used to be like, it's hard, but it's fair. Well, math is hard, but it's fair. They used to say, what else did they used to say? If it was easy, anybody could do it, right? That's true. If STEM was easy, anybody could do it. So it's hard because only people who are dedicated will excel at it. They say pain is weakness leaving the body. Well, any pain you may feel in your mind when you're doing math, that's mental weakness leaving the body, right? All those cliches that people say in sports apply. You know what I'm saying? Those were just my thoughts, man. That kind of came when I was after listening to that video. You know what I'm saying? We want to combat any attempts to keep us out of STEM or any attempts that encourage us to go into STEM but push us to the lower levels of that hierarchy. You know what I'm saying? I honestly feel like one of the best ways of combating that is creating a cultural mythology or fiction that either deifies if you're into religion or elevates, if you're not into religion, elevates science, technology, engineering, and math, right? But yeah, that's all I have to say for now on that topic. Peace.